The queen came in the queen cage, and I popped out the cork from the end and then had her go into this marking tube. And then now she won't flip over for me. I need to get it so that her back is up where the blue grid is, and then I'll use my pen through one of the holes to put a dot on her back. Come on, girl, flip over. There we go. Okay, you don't want to squish her, so you're trying to get her so she can't run around, but oops. There we go. You're trying to get her right in the middle of her thorax. So now our queen has a nice bright mark in the middle of her thorax, which should make her easy to pick out in the hive. So we'll put her back in the queen cage and go install the package. Today we're going to be installing a new 3-pound package of bees that we got from Nature's Nectar in Stillwater, Minnesota. These are Saskatraz, or at least their queen is. This is called a bee bus, this plastic cage. Many of the traditional cages are made out of plywood and screens, but this, as you can see, has there's basically air is able to move through all 6 sides of the cage because it has perforations all the way around. And then in the center you can see the can that has the 1-to-1 sugar water mixture that they feed on while they're in transport. So I don't know how well you can see this, but there's the 2 divots on either side of the can, and there's a slot in those. And the queen cage was in there, but I've already removed the queen cage. And basically the way that I did that was I whacked the cage down hard to get the bees to fall off. Then I put my fingers in on both sides of the can, pulled the can out, actually used my hive tool to pop it loose. Then once I had the can out, then I pulled out the queen cage and then put the can back in. Okay, what I'm going to do here is when I'm ready to start installing the bees, I'm going to take that can, actually I can leave that, well no, I have to take the can out, and when I take the can out, then I will also pop open the end of the bee bus. Now I'm actually going to loosen the end of the bee bus now because it's hard to do, it takes a little bit of doing. There's 2, you can kind of see on the side here, there's 2 latches that hold the door closed. And so what I'll do is I'll pry that so that it's popped around those latches, and then all I should have to do is slide that open and get them out. So that's what I'll be doing. Okay, and let me show you the queen. So as I mentioned, we've already marked her. She's in the queen cage. I have her in my pocket to keep her warm. You can see her crawling around inside there. And you can see that on the end we've got a cork in the hole. And before I put the queen cage into the hive, I will be pulling that cork out, and I'll be putting a mini marshmallow in the end, and then the workers will actually eat their way through that to release the queen out of the queen cage. So I'm just going to put her back in my pocket. You can kind of see her mark there. I don't know how well you can see it, but she does have the white mark on the middle of her back, on her thorax. Most beginning beekeepers don't mark their queens, and you need to be careful when you do it because you can damage the queen. You can get, if you get the paint on her eyes, it can actually cause the bees to not like her, and they could end up killing her and superseding her. So you need to be very careful doing that. I don't suggest that most new beekeepers mark their queens. Okay, I'm going to put her back in my pocket now to keep her warm. So I'm prying open the latches so that I have it so that all I got to do is just pull the door and it'll pop open. I don't want to do that now, or I'll end up having bees come out, and I don't want them to come out yet because I don't have the hive open for them yet. Okay, I've got that in front of the latches now. Okay, I'm going to set this down out of the way. So here's my new 1 deep 8 frame. I'm going to take off the telescoping cover, move that out of the way, take off the inner cover, move that out of the way. Now I've got all 8 frames in there. Now these are frames that have been used before, so they do have a drawn comb on them. If you are a new beekeeper, you won't have that. You'll either have new frames with just foundation, or if you're like me and you're foundationless, you'll have new frames that have nothing in them. So I'm going to pull one of these out so you can see what it looks like. You can't put the bees in until you pull some out anyway. But here is an example of one of the deep frames that's fairly well drawn out, not completely drawn out, but you can see that the bees have done a fair amount, and you can see, since you can see all the way through on the bottom of the frame, you can tell that there's no foundation in here. So we're going to set that off to one side. We want to open up the center 4 spots so that we can dump the bees right in the middle. So, and actually, I wanted to get the 3rd one in first. 3rd one, 4th one, 5th one, and 6th one. So now I've got a spot open in the middle that I've got 4 frames wide. I've got 2 frames on each side. If you're doing 10 frame equipment, you'd have 3 frames on each side to have 4 open spots in the middle. At this point now, I'm ready to put the bees in. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to knock them down off of the can as much as I can. No pun intended. So I'm going to whack that against the table here to do that. Okay, now all I got to do is put them up here, open the door, and dump them into the hive. You're going to get some in the air. Depending on how cold it is, the colder it is, the less that'll fly. It happens to be pretty warm today. It's around 65 degrees. So you want to try to get as many of the bees out of here as you can. And you just do that by whacking it a few times to get them loose. Then once you've got most of the bees inside, there'll still be a few stragglers in there, and that's okay. Okay, now they're all going to be mostly on the bottom of the hive body. So now you want to take these frames, you want to put them back in carefully. Try not to crush any bees if you can avoid it.
Got some kiss bees over here.
Okay. Yeah, actually. Okay, so I also have a spray bottle that has some 1-to-1 syrup in it. I can actually spray that on them to settle them down a little bit because they're getting a little excited here on me. We don't really want that. If you don't want to hose them down, you just put a little spritz on them, and then that gives them something to do while you're working on this. They'll work on cleaning their bodies off, and you can get them into the hive. Okay. Now the last frame goes in. Okay, so now I've got all the frames in. Now I need to put the queen in. And the way that you do that is you take the queen cage and you take this wire that's on here and you need to bend it so that it's going 90 degrees. You want it so that the wire goes out sideways from the cage. So it comes out like that because we're going to bend it over the top of a frame to hold it in place. And that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, if you've got some duct tape, you can actually duct tape that wire that goes over the top of the frame. You can duct tape that to have it hold better. Generally, friction does a pretty good job of holding it in place, so you don't really have to worry about it. But if you're worried that your cage, if you have just foundation, then you might have to be more worried about the cage falling down. But since I've got drawn comb, that's not as big of a deal. So at this point, the queen's in there, the bees are in there with her. Oh, ha! Except I forgot one step. I gotta pull the queen back out because I didn't take the cork out. I have to replace that with a mini marshmallow. And you just need to get it in there as best as you can so that it doesn't fall out, which my gloves are kind of sticky, so that's making it hard. There we go. So now we have the marshmallow in the queen cage. So now I can put the queen cage back in. And And you have to make sure the screen is either facing forward or backward. If you have it facing sideways, then they won't be able to get to the queen and tend to her, and she will die. So it's very important that that queen is accessible to the workers. And I'm going to give them a little spritz to kind of settle them down a bit. They should be able to tell that she's in there now, and eventually they'll work their way back in. I can also use my bee brush to try to get them inside a little bit better. All right, most of them are inside. There's a few flying around, but that's going to happen. So now we want to put our inner cover on. Try not to squish any more bees than absolutely necessary. All right, so the package is installed. All these ones that are loose out here, they're going to smell their queen and figure out that pretty soon they're going to figure out that they need to go back inside there. One of the ways that you can make it so that the bees will more readily accept the queen and get the hive moving more quickly is you feed them with 1-to-1 sugar water, especially if you're using either brand new frames or brand new frames with foundation where they have no drawn comb and no sort of source of food you have to feed them, or they will starve to death. So this is early enough. This is the first week of April, so we do have some pollen on the trees, but there's no nectar source yet, and the nectar is what they need to eat in order to live. So at this point, all I need to do, I have a feeder that I've made. I'll put that in place. This is a hive top feeder. You can use, there's obviously lots of different kinds. In our area, you don't want to use Boardman feeders, the kind that go to the entrance, because it gets too cold here and they won't work. Oops, I did kill a couple. Oh well. All right, and then put our jars of feed in, turn them upside down, let them drip out a little bit, set them in. And that gives them food. This is especially important if they don't have any drawn honeycomb, because they need the energy from the sugar water in order to be able to draw out that wax. All right, so now the feeder's installed. Now we've got an empty deep that we'll just put over the top to cover that. And there's a fair number of bees in here, but there's really not much I can do about that at this point. I'll just put the super on it, or the telescoping cover on, then later I'll come out and see if I can get them to come out after they've settled down a bit. And then last but not least, you put your rock on top to hold the top on. And that's all there is to installing a package of bees. So one thing I could have mentioned as I was installing the bees is that on a warm day like today, it would be okay to spritz them, mist them with the 1-to-1 sugar water that I had in my spray bottle. That would help settle them down while they were in the cage. So you spray them in the cage before you actually dump them out, and less are going to go into the air that way. As you can see, there's quite a few in the air here. And then when you're done and you've emptied out the bee bus or the cage that your package came in, you can set it out in front of the hive like this, and the bees, any bees that are left inside, eventually will work their way into the hive. Notice that I have the entrance reducer in place. I'll zoom in here so you can see. It's the smallest setting, so that since this is a new hive and they're just getting established, they're not that strong yet, you need to minimize the size of the entrance that they have to defend from robbing bees or wasps or any other predators. As compared to a hive that I've overwintered, like this one over here, notice that I've got the wide setting for the entrance reducer open because it's early in the spring. As the population of the hive builds, I'll end up pulling that entrance reducer out entirely, and then the one over here on the new hive with the new package in it, I'll actually pull out the entrance reducer and spin it so that the wider opening is exposed so that more bees can get in and out. And then also notice that at the top of the deep I have notches in my inner cover, so they actually have an upper entrance as well. Yeah, let me get out a little farther. So, well, yeah, I guess you can see that. So they're kind of crowded around it right now, but right in the center of the picture there, you can see that there's a notch in the inner cover that gives them another entrance. So between those two entrances, they should be able to get back into the hive, no problem.